Many of you know David Talbot, I'm sure, from the days as the founder and editor of Salon and author of Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, and particularly The Season of the Witch, wonderful history about San Francisco. If you've read those books and haven't yet tried The Devil's Chessboard, you are in for just a remarkable experience. It's really kind of hard for me to come to grips with my reaction to this book. I was telling Elaine earlier on that I'd read a chapter, a couple of chapters or two, and I'd sit down and explain to her. She said, "Not that, too." It was sort of like the history of the United States from 1943 on through 1963. And it's a history that I kind of take personally. I grew up during that period, and I had no idea that this was going on. And I kept believing the United States was just a wonderful place that it really is on the surface, and that none of this stuff was going along under the surface to disturb it. But it was going on, and in a way that I kind of personally resent. It starts with Alan Dulles' time really kind of undermining U.S. policy during World War II, his days in Switzerland, dealing with the Nazis. Particularly nasty kind of thing to do, and goes on to an abuse of power continuing over a period of 20 years. I'm not going to say any more about it. I just urge you to read it. You're going to find it incredibly informative, wonderfully revealing, and you're going to get mad while you do it. But that's okay. It's a good kind of mad, because it'll be mad, a constructive kind of mad. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce David Talbot.
I'm going to strip down for this, because
in those lights.
Take it on.
Well, thank you all for coming out here. I remember once I was here before, years ago, on a rainy night, and there was only 3 or 4 people, and I knew 3 or 4 of them, so I only know 3 or 4 of you tonight, so thank you very much. Well, I'm going to start with a few prepared remarks. Sometimes I wing these things and jump right in, but today I felt inspired, like writing something for you, because I know all of you people in Marin appreciate literary effort. So I'm going to start by just reading a few prepared remarks, and then I'd love to open this up to a conversation as early as we can, because I know you want to go have dinner and drink later. But I do think all the conversations I've been having about this book around the country tap into a deep need I think that all of us feel these days, about a country that seems out of control. And certainly the presidential campaign doesn't seem to really address some of these underlying issues that we'll be talking about tonight. So this I think of as a town hall, a little exercise in democracy, so thank you very much for coming out. We live in a dangerous moment of imperial decline, when America's iron will and terrifying capacity for violence is increasingly frustrated by global realities and local resistance. In our growing frustration, we keep expanding our war on terror, a perpetual war machine with no end in sight. And we build a bigger and bigger Big Brother, an all-seeing, all-encompassing intelligence machine that vacuums up virtually every human communication in the world, and then crunches this limitless data down to a daily kill list. Democracy and humanity itself is all but removed from this largely automated process. As national security analyst William Arkin has written, just like we have lethal unmanned aircraft patrolling the world's skies, we also have an unmanned presidency. This dark state of affairs, part Orwell, part Philip K. Dick, part Game of Thrones, is a legacy of master spy Alan Dulles, the creator of America's modern intelligence system and the CIA's longest-serving director. Extraordinary rendition, torture, mind control experimentation, extra-legal assassinations, massive surveillance of private citizens, and subversion of even friendly governments. These all originated not after 9/11, but during the Cold War reign of Alan Dulles. we're still living in the world that he created. Reagan's lawless CIA Director William Casey, iron-assed and arrogant Dick Cheney, as George H.W. Bush has referred to him, and Donald Rumsfeld, Obama's sanctimonious CIA Director and top assassin John Brennan. They're all heirs to the Dulles legacy. The intelligence world, of course, is by its very nature wrapped in secrecy. It was my job as an investigative historian to not only shine a light on this world, but to make it come alive in the most compelling way for the reader, for you. I'm very glad to see how many critics have called The Devil's Chessboard a gripping page-turner. This year's best spy thriller isn't fiction, it's history, as a Salon writer put it. One would be hard-pressed to find a book that is better at evoking the strange and apocalyptic atmospherics of the early Cold War years in America. Neither Le Carré nor Graham Greene could do any better, said the Daily Beast. Even a website closely connected to the CIA, while attacking my book as, quote, Soviet propaganda, of all things, thought the Soviet Union was gone, grudgingly admitted it was a damn good read, and they wished I had written it instead as a novel. Well, this is all very gratifying because, as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. once pointed out, history is an ongoing argument. And I believe that the best story always wins. The story of Allen Dulles and the rise of America's secret government is indeed a remarkable story. My book is based on newly released government documents, the emotionally searing correspondence of Dulles' wife Clover and his mistress Mary Bancroft, who, by the way, became friends and referred to the man who dominated both of their lives as the Shark, as well as interviews with the sons and daughters of Dulles and other legendary spies. The epic story begins with World War II, when Dulles slipped across the border to Switzerland as America's top spy in continental Europe and proceeded to secretly negotiate with Nazi officials in direct defiance of President Roosevelt's ban on separate deal-making with Hitler's regime. This pattern of insubordination and outright treason continued throughout Dulles' career, right up to his explosive break with President John F. Kennedy. I conclude the book, and this of course is the most controversial part of my book, by making the case that Allen Dulles was centrally involved in the assassination of JFK as well as the cover-up of the crime in his convenient role as a dominating member of the Warren Commission. Dulles was fired by JFK after the CIA's disastrous invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. But the spy master didn't get the memo. He simply went home to Georgetown and continued to operate as if he still ran the spy agency, meeting with his top deputies and pursuing goals that ran counter to Kennedy administration policy. Among those Dulles continued to meet with at his home and communicate with were several CIA officers and a Mafia-connected Cuban exile leader who later came under suspicion by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, as well as other Kennedy investigators. Under President Eisenhower, Allen Dulles had created a very effective killing machine to remove foreign obstacles to U.S. security interests, which generally amounted to the same thing as American corporate interests, whether in Iran, Guatemala, or Congo. Dulles essentially brought home this assassination team to Dallas in November 1963. I began my book with a quote from an Eric Ambler novel. Ambler is one of the spy novelists, of course, who inspired Le Carré and Graham Greene, speaking of the great masters. This is a book he wrote in the late 1930s, Coffin for Demetrios. He said, the important thing to know about an assassination is not who fired the shot, but who paid for the bullet. Allen Dulles was no rogue agent. He was not some supervillain who single-handedly changed the course of American history. He was part of an elite network of powerful men who thought democracy was too important to be left in the hands of the likes of you and me, or our elected representatives. And this is what makes him even more frightening, because his deceit, his contempt for democracy and the rule of law, his violent aggression, this was all too representative of American power in general in his day, and perhaps today as well. In the end, or in the final analysis, as JFK would say, my book is the epic story of the struggle between the forces of democracy and secret government. This is a story that continues to this very day in the age of Snowden and Manning and the recently leaked drone papers, which all of us should read in The Intercept. It's the story of the arrogance of power and the democratic heroes who challenged its iron rule. Thank you very much.
Somebody like to, there's so many things to talk about with this book, but go ahead, you start here.
This is for me.
Me? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. What do we know, please, about Alan Dulles' deals with the Nazis when he was in Switzerland? Just curious.
What do we know about his dealing with the Nazis? Well, quite a bit. I began the book with this. This is the first third of my book, in fact. Because of political pressure, Congress passed a law called the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 1998. How many people know about that law? One of the few sunshine laws that's been pushed through that forces government agencies, and the CIA in particular, to release documents related to contacts and relations between U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA, the agency that Dulles worked with during World War II, and their Nazis, various Nazi counterparts. So I relied heavily on many of those documents. I also was able to find my researcher, Karen Croft, who's here tonight, a wonderful source, a guy named William Gowan, who was, as a very young man, 18 or 19 years old, stationed in Rome at the end of the war, and was engaged in a kind of a spy versus spy. He was part of U.S. Army intelligence, and just as quickly as he and his unit would go around arresting escaping Nazi war criminals who were escaping via the Nazi rat lines that had been set up by people like Dulles. These were the escape routes over the Alps and down through Italy and then overseas. They would grab these guys, William Gowan and his unit of very dedicated Nazi hunters, and put them in jail, and then Dulles and his cohorts would let them out the back way. So what Dulles, the game he was playing was this. It wasn't that he was, a Nazi himself. He was, reflexively, I think, anti-Semitic. That was sort of the coloring of that whole group of men in the State Department, in intelligence in America in those years. They thought of Jews as the other. He didn't really have particularly strong human feelings for many people, but Jews in particular, he didn't seem to have any feeling for their plight at all. And so while he was stationed in Switzerland, he would get, at great risk to these people's lives, these people who were Germans slipping across the border to warn the West about the final solution that was underway, and that the camps were being built. He could have acted on those. He was our eyes and ears in continental Europe. He should have acted on those, obviously. But he did not feel any particular urgency to relay these messages back to Washington, which could have used these messages to take action. So what he was more intent on was keeping track of what was happening in Germany and making sure that Germany emerged from the war a strong partner in what he felt was the true war to come, which was the Cold War, the war with the Soviet Union. And so he was very intent, again in direct defiance of President Roosevelt and the Allied policy of unconditional surrender, which was set out at Casablanca with Churchill in 1943. We're going to crush this evil regime, we're going to bring these men to justice, no separate dealing with them, no separate peace. Alan Dulles, again, didn't get that memo, and he went forward with his own secret negotiations with Nazi officials. And they ultimately resulted in a separate peace being struck as Roosevelt was dying and was incapable of really intervening in the final days of the war with Nazi forces in Italy. And strategically, that deal that Dulles cut with the SS general in Italy, Karl Wolff, really didn't mean much of anything. Very few lives, if any, were saved. The only lives that were saved were the necks of these Nazi officials that he cut this deal with. So that was the game he was playing. He was always pursuing the interests and the strategic aims of his group. And his group were the group of Wall Street men. He and his brother had run the largest law firm on Wall Street, Sullivan and Cromwell. They'd represented many of these German firms, I.G. Farben among them, the notorious chemical conglomerate that produced the gas that killed the Jews. They had no problems with hiding these companies' assets during the war, using Swiss banks to launder this loot, this Nazi loot. And, they tended to think of Roosevelt, Morgenthau, and those people in the Roosevelt administration who had a different perspective as weak, as sentimental, and so on, while they had a much tougher view of the world.
Right here.
Yes, right here. Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right word to describe the book, and I was talking to gentleman Richard, and to me this book's like a symphony. You have all these different movements that come together brilliantly. I think this is a masterwork, and I've read everything, so congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
Can you,
Absolutely.
could you hear the question back there, what it said?
Compare my book to
It's a
Beethoven.
it's a symphony, and it's beautiful.
Thank you.
Whatever.
Thank you. No, that touches me because I worked very, very hard on the writing of this book, not just the research.
I know that you did, but my question is, I've sat in audiences listening to people like Robert Dallek and Chris Matthews talk about how much they love JFK. In fact, Matthews is working on a new book on the 1960 campaign, and he was going on and on about, what a great pal JFK was. But yet both those guys, when I asked them, not only wouldn't talk about the subject, but it basically said, the Warren Commission got it totally right. There's no conspiracy, nothing happened, whatever the case may be. What is your take on people like that and the New York Times and others who refuse to even consider or acknowledge that there may be a different point of view?
It's too traumatic for those interests to acknowledge. So the question is about why historians like Robert Dallek and commentators like Chris Matthews, both of whom obviously have a deep interest in JFK, why they won't go there. They won't go to the most interesting and darkest aspects of JFK's epic story, which is why he was killed, number one. There was a reason for why he was killed. I'll always remember I interviewed Ted Sorensen, who was, of course, Kennedy's brilliant and poetic speechwriter. Ask Not, that was Ted Sorensen. And he, at that point, when I interviewed him for my earlier book, Brothers, had not come around to the idea that Kennedy had been killed by a conspiracy. He did, in fact, in his final days, come around to that conclusion. But he felt that, he'd become a corporate lawyer later. He was part of the system. You can see the kind of mechanism at work in these men, even the most decent and the most honest men who were part of this, Kennedy saga, couldn't bring themselves around to the idea that our own government was somehow part of it. Because once you enter that dark doorway, then, everything is suspect. So look, men like Chris Matthews, I edited Chris at the Old Examiner, sweet guy, very, I think a good-hearted guy, but not particularly deep, not particularly courageous. These guys make a lot of money as Beltway pundits. They're invested in the system. Robert Dallek actually came around to my position after Brothers came out, which is there was a split in the Kennedy administration. There's the motive. For years, conventional historians had refused to face that. Oh, Kennedy was, a cold warrior, he was a hawk. There was no reason for hardliners to kill him. He was one of them. Well, that's BS. There was a split over the Cold War within the Kennedy presidency, and even now historians like Dallek, very conventional, safe historians, have come around to acknowledge that. Even Chris Matthews has. So once you've taken that step and said, well, there was this very bitter split within the Kennedy presidency over the Cold War. He had opened up peace channels to Khrushchev and to Fidel Castro in Havana, and there was a strong reaction from the CIA and the hardliners in the Pentagon. They will acknowledge that now. Well then, you got to go the next step too then and see, whoa, there's also compelling evidence that ties some of these enemies of JFK within his own administration, including Allen Dulles, to the actual crime in Dallas. And that's what I do And I think ultimately that will become the historical consensus, that we're dealing with, flawed men, weak men, people who are part of the system, and I don't think we'll ever get Dalek and Chris Matthews to go all the way.
Could you comment for a moment on what Howard Hunt confessed to later on in his life?
Absolutely. Well, I present all the evidence in the final third of the book, and I think obviously there's no smoking guns. The CIA doesn't leave smoking guns lying around. If there are smoking guns, they're still withholding 1,100 documents, by the way, in defiance of the JFK Records Act passed in the 90s. Those documents actually might have at least some smoldering guns, as I put it, if not smoking guns. But yeah, I mean, here's some of the mind-blowing things that American people should know about. And this has been brought to their attention, a little bit brought to our attention over the last 10 years or so by various journalists and investigators, but for the most part, the mainstream media hasn't been listening. So one of the things that was reported was about 10 years ago, Howard Hunt, the famous CIA spy, leader of the Watergate burglary team, who was, again, part of this sort of Dulles cabal, was a gung-ho Cold Warrior, Kennedy hater, and the real split, of course, happens at the Bay of Pigs when these gung-ho guys want to overthrow Castro, think Kennedy his will has failed, and he doesn't go all the way, and send in the Marines and the Air Force to take out Castro. From that point on, people like Hunt become these diehard Kennedy enemies. So by Howard Hunt's own admission to his son, I've seen the tapes. He left tapes behind, his own writing. He said that he was part of a team, and these other people in this assassination team are names that are very familiar to investigators like me, that met in Miami sometime before November 1963 and began to work out the plan to kill Kennedy. The other key person that Hunt named was William Harvey, very significant character, and my book for the first time places William Harvey in Dallas in November '63. Now, why is William Harvey important? Because he was the head of Dulles' assassination team. He was the guy that Dulles promoted to be in charge of the very important at the time anti-Castro CIA Mafia plot to take out Fidel Castro. So now you have William Harvey, you have Hunt, you have another guy named David Morales, who was a very well-known CIA thug who was involved in the killing of Che, and he was basically, when you see David Morales coming at you, you better start making out your will. So he was another guy, by his own admission, who was involved in the Kennedy assassination before his death. So the old thing was, well, someone would have talked if there was a conspiracy. I mean, America is like, we're so saturated with media and people are confessing all the time. Well, people were talking and no one was really listening. I could go into great detail. I interviewed Ben Bradley at the Washington Post. I talked to Don Hewitt, the creator of 60 Minutes. Why didn't you break this case? Because both of them basically told me they knew the Warren Commission wasn't the real story. So these are the people at the top of our investigative media chain saying they knew the truth and they never pursued it. Why? Because Ben Bradley had the courage at least to tell me why he was a coward. He thought his career would have been damaged, and it would have, certainly, if he had used the investigative resources of the Washington Post to stir this up. This would have been a huge trauma for the American system. I quote Charles de Gaulle, because he was one of the people in the know within the world's elite who figured this out pretty quickly. Charles de Gaulle himself, of course, had been the target many times of assassination plots because of the sort of blowback from the Algerian War when he settled that very bitter war, colonial war in Algeria. His right-wing generals came after him, a group called the Secret Army Organization. You all know The Day of the Jackal, the famous spy novel and film that was based on one of the assassination attempts. And de Gaulle was very aware of sort of all this tension within the United States national security system, his own, as basically these leaders were trying to navigate their way through the Cold War and the end of the colonial era. And he came back from Washington after the funeral with JFK, and he told his information minister it was a plot. Lee Harvey Oswald is just a fall guy, but the American system will never be able to address this, honestly, and the truth will never come out in our lifetime, is what he said. So that's what they all knew. They were all talking about it among themselves, Bobby Kennedy and so on. The American people, though, thought, these people thought it should be kept in the dark. Yes, back here.
Do you think Mockingbird had something to do with those guys, the media being quiet for the last 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great untold stories. There's been scholarly books written about it. Operation Mockingbird was a very extensive CIA program, again, that Allen Dulles started to manipulate the media. And so, we know from Carl Bernstein wrote a very important piece way back in the 1970s, the Watergate Reporter, not for the Washington Post, that wouldn't run it, but for Rolling Stone, in which he named CIA assets in the media, some very famous people at the time, including the heads of the New York Times, the heads of CBS, the heads of the Washington Post. These are all people who were either very, very socially close to the heads of the CIA and, were at cocktail parties with them, and, their kids went to the same schools and they're part of that same sort of Georgetown set, or in some cases actually were on the CIA payroll. So, the war of ideas was very important to these people. I have a whole chapter in this. And so when people say, oh, well, the media would have broken this case, wide open if there had been a conspiracy in Dulles, I mean, you just see the extent to which Dulles was a master, not just Dulles, but his whole sort of team of intellectuals. James Jesus Angleton, who was like a frustrated poet and a brilliant guy who was one of the key people in Operation Mockingbird. How they funded journals, everything from the Paris Review to Encounter magazine. They funded poetry journals. They funded arts conferences, films, books. They had a whole publishing arm. This was a vast world. They called it the mighty Wurlitzer because they were playing like this great organ. That had this huge impact on the world as a whole during the Cold War, and I think still there is an operation like that to this very day. We could talk about what's happened with my book, which is a whole other story.
Yes, let's do that. What's that? Tell us.
Yes, right here.
Yes, in addition to the split in the Kennedy administration, I've also read that Kennedy was interested, and I don't know how far he got with this, with issuing debt-free currency, which I assume would bypass the Federal Reserve entirely. Can you talk about that a little bit, and if you think that is in fact a factor in this assassination?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in that particular area, but there were many ways that Kennedy was irritating the Dulles Circle. So when I say the Dulles Circle, I mean, basically sort of the top people on Wall Street, the oil industry who were his clients, and the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran, of course, was a sort of payoff to those clients. The national security, people in the top levels of the national security system, and they sort of shuttle back and forth between their Wall Street jobs and Washington. It's what C. Wright Mills, the great sociologist of his day, called the power elite, and which some scholars today call the deep state. It's this kind of permanent, power group that seems to keep running the country no matter who's elected. So that group was irritated by Kennedy for a number of reasons. One, and I think the primary reason, was that he was trying to find a way out of the Cold War. And the Cold War, as Eisenhower told us, was basically a huge racket. I mean, there were like fortunes being made. It was, the economy had been largely militarized by then, even more so today. And so, Eisenhower warned us as he left the White House about this vast, sort of nexus of economic and political power called the military-industrial complex. And that's what Kennedy was up against. But he did do other things. The U.S. steel crisis, I think, was a very important showdown, where Kennedy basically thought he had a deal in 1962 with the heads of U.S. steel industry. And because the rising steel prices were a real engine of inflation back then, sort of had this major ripple effect throughout the economy. So as an attempt to control inflation, Kennedy sat down with the top union leaders and the top CEOs of all the steel companies, and he thought he had a deal. Well, just as he's about to announce it, Roger Blau, the head of U.S. Steel, basically stabs him back, comes to the White House and says, forget it, I'm announcing a rise in prices tomorrow. And so the Kennedy brothers did what the Kennedy brothers did really well. They played hardball, to use a Chris Matthews phrase. And Bobby Kennedy's Attorney General has the FBI raid the offices of steel executives, goes through all their files, finds not just financial stuff, but personal stuff about them. the Defense Department under Robert McNamara suddenly cuts off all contracts to U.S. Steel. They caved within 2 or 3 days. But they were furious. I mean, the steel and the business press. I mean, imagine today if Obama did something that aggressive, and to them this was like, like a socialist revolution had happened. So if you read the Wall Street Journal, you read Fortune magazine, the sort of fury within that world, that class of people against Kennedy was enormous, and Kennedy felt it. Kennedy often joked about assassination, or he played around with that idea. He discussed it with friends. He felt this tension building in Washington. And so, with that great Kennedy wit, he tried to deflect it. So after this enormous steel crisis, he was at the Waldorf Astoria giving a speech, and he heard that Eisenhower, former president, was accepting an award from the steel industry at a banquet hall in the same hotel at the Waldorf. And so he, in his funny way, he got up to the stage and he said, the steel industry tried to give me a present too recently, but the Secret Service wouldn't let them. So again, he's definitely channeling that. He at one point asked, his friend John Frankenheimer to make the film 7 Days in May, based on the best-selling novel, of course, that about an attempted coup, a military coup against an American president. And Schlesinger, the historian who worked in the Kennedy White House, later told me that was Kennedy's way of trying to alert the American people to the fact that these tensions really were building in Washington.
Don't forget
Yes,
the oil
there.
depletion allowance issue too.
Yes, that as well. Oil depletion allowance, which Kennedy was trying to close that loophole, which would have cost perhaps billions of dollars to the oil industry, was another flashpoint for for the 1%, let's say. Yes, here.
I want to ask you a little off track about Syria. Right now, there's forces saying it's if we don't go into Syria in a big way and protect our national interests, which I'm not sure what they are, we're going to be overrun by terrorists, and other terrible things are going to happen. And this is so much like things that Dulles felt like also. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I know when we were fighting in Vietnam, they said the domino effect would happen if we didn't fight and everything would turn communist, and that didn't happen. But now they're making arguments for increasing the war in Syria, and I'd like to know what you think.
Well, there's always a reason, right, for us to be at war somewhere in the world. And this has been the case. I'm 64 years old, and many of you are our same generation. I mean, basically throughout our entire lives, America's been at war somewhere in the world. We always find a pretext. Basically, I think the neocon lobby, Wolfowitz, Pearl, all the Cheney, Rumsfeld, all those people who later then came to power under the idiot son, Bush. They for years before Bush was elected, were pushing for this kind of let's remake the Middle East kind of policy. Well, we did. We broke it. And Syria and ISIS and the Islamic State, all of that are now the fallout from having broken the Middle East and trying to rearrange it. At first I thought that was just sort of ideological hubris, but I've come to think that in some ways that might have been the intent, to sort of break Syria, to break Iran and Iraq, and let chaos reign, because that's certainly what's happened. And of course then that gives us more enemies to kill. I just think the drone assassination program, we could talk about that, which again is a direct legacy of Dulles, who decided he could kill anyone he wanted to around the world. Now we just have the technological means to do it in a much cleaner way. But I think that is such a stain on America. And I think not only a stain on a country morally and ethically, and certainly on the Obama presidency, but also just is strategically mad. Because I think it's creating more enemies and generations of enemies than it's eliminating, and anyway, we won't go into anything. Yes, in the back there. Yes, the woman here. Yes, you.
Okay, So what about, because we know the Bush family, Prescott Bush, George Bush, were very much part of that whole elite thing in Germany as well as, afterwards. What do you think they knew about it?
Well, Prescott Bush was Allen Dulles' man in the Senate. There was virtually no congressional oversight over the CIA during Dulles' reign. He was once interviewed by John Chancellor for an NBC special shortly after he left the CIA, but he never really did leave the CIA. He was asked about this. Well, does Congress ever ask you things or look into things? He goes, well, I try. He goes, Dulles said this, I try to go up there on the Hill and testify and tell them what's going on, but they say, no, we don't want to hear. We may talk in our sleep. As if, as if to say, look, this is too secret, too, delicate a world for Congress democratically to intervene in. So that's, pretty much was the attitude he got. They gave him a blank check. He would check in with his people. Prescott Bush, the senator from Connecticut, the head of the dynasty, being one of the key ones. Prescott was furious when JFK fired Dulles. There was a letter in Allen Dulles' file I came across from Prescott to Clover Dulles after Allen Dulles died, sort of just talking about how stunned and furious he was when he heard that Kennedy had done this. So I think that was the general feeling, that Dulles was such a pillar of that world, and the Bush family was part of it, that for a president, particularly an upstart president, and Kennedy was seen by many in this world, despite his family's wealth and all that, as an outsider. He wasn't part of that sort of Council on Foreign Relations, which was the key group where they worked out their policy ideas. He wasn't a member of that group. He was someone as a young senator in the 50s who was starting to question some of the sort of underlying assumptions of the Cold War and the Dulles brothers' policy. Because remember, it wasn't just Allen Dulles, it was John Foster Dulles, who the airport's named after, his brother, who was Secretary of State. So it was a 1-2 punch there. But Kennedy was starting to criticize the colonial wars in Vietnam, in Algeria. He was upsetting this Cold War establishment by starting to rethink these things and recognizing that history was changing, and that there was this new earthquake that was developing in the Third World. These countries wanted their freedom, and that the West had to find some way of accommodating that. But that wasn't the Dulles brothers' policy. Yes, in the corner.
Talk about the interesting things in relation to the book. You said you could go there.
Pardon me?
You were going to go into interesting.
In reaction to my book, right?
Yeah.
Well, so look, I mean, this is how they play the game. There still is a mighty Wurlitzer, a propaganda machine that the CIA runs. They've got their hands full with the war on terror. I don't know how many resources they devote to books like mine and so on. But here's what happened right on the eve of before my book came out. I think what they do now is I call it counter-programming. When my book Brothers came out, I was told that Vincent Bugliosi's book, which took a very different point of view, to say the least, a 1,000-page book, the publisher changed the pub date so it would go right up against mine, and we were on all the same shows together. And I think this time they did a couple things. One was they suddenly leaked some documents to a friendly journalist named Phil Shannon, who had been a New York Times guy, and he wrote a book on the Warren Commission, which I didn't think was very good. And these documents basically, sort of refueled literally the oldest disinformation conspiracy theory about the Kennedy assassination in the book, which is that Fidel Castro killed Kennedy. So that has been knocked down repeatedly. In fact, Kennedy had opened a back channel, a peace channel, using, by the way, the guy played by Tom Hanks in the new Spielberg movie, Bridge of Spies. So that guy, Jim Donovan, was this heroic guy, citizen diplomat, and after he did his thing in Berlin, freeing Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot, he then was recruited by Kennedy to go to Havana to open up diplomatic channels there with Fidel Castro. And the CIA, knowing that Kennedy had opened up this secret peace channel, went to Donovan before he was about to go to Havana for another trip and he and Fidel had really hit it off. Donovan's this Irish guy who liked to talk all night and drink, and so does Fidel. So he won the release of the 1,100 prisoners, Bay of Pigs prisoners, and he was kind of on a roll, and Kennedy wanted him to keep opening up that sort of peace channel. Anyway, the CIA comes to Donovan and says, hey, on your next trip there, we hear Fidel loves to go scuba diving. Why don't you take him this wetsuit? And of course, as we know from the church committee hearings later, that wetsuit was poisoned. Fortunately for Fidel, he didn't take that wetsuit. Apparently he bought his own, Donovan, at Abercrombie and Fitch in New York, and so Fidel lived. But, I mean, this is, again, the way that the CIA on many occasions would try to subvert Kennedy policy. They would hear that he was doing something, generally, to sort of defuse the Cold War in the name of peace, and they would subvert that policy. And there's many cases of this in my book. And I'm forgetting so how are they screwing with my book? So,
Do you scuba dive?
yeah, exactly. Someone just asked me whether no, they haven't offered me a wetsuit yet. But they, what they're doing is they counter program. So I think what they did was they leaked these documents with great fanfare, and kind of all these, stories went around in the media about, Fidel Castro, new information suggests that the CIA withheld this information from the Warren Commission back in 1963, 64, that would have pointed the investigation at Castro, bullshit, So again, Phil Shannon is gullible. He ran with it. He did a big story. I was supposed to have a story in Politico, the online publication, based on my book. At the last minute, the editor said, oh, no, we're not going to run your story. We're going to run Phil Shannon's CIA leaked story. So, that's, I think, the way they play the game. I was on my way to an interview at Al Jazeera America, of all places. Do you think they would have, guts to stand up to this pressure? But I was literally in the car on the way in Manhattan to the studio, and my publicist sitting next to me got an email saying it was off, the interview's off, and he said, what? It never happened to me before. And they just sent back one email response saying politics. So they still do that stuff. The New York Times has not reviewed the book, and if they did review it, probably would be a mixed blessing, given how critical I am of the New York Times and how I think they've been complicit with the CIA and U.S. intelligence over the years. The Washington Post explicitly said they would not review my book. So there's this blackout that's happened. And so to me, it was such a great moment, hugely gratifying moment when the book, despite sort of the mainstream media blackout, hit the bestseller list. It hit the New York Times, it hit the Northern California, and it hit the LA Times just on Sunday, number 7. So, I mean, this is like a testament to American people's, I think, hunger for this information, and to alternative media like Democracy Now!, Amy Goodman, whose show really had a big, and to Salon, the publication I started, and Mother Jones, where I used to work, and and to social media. I'm very active on Facebook, and I think the word's gotten out through there. So there are these cracks in the system. I always quote this, and forgive me if you've heard this before, but Leonard Cohen's song, there's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. And I think that's the truth. We still live in a country where that's possible, thank God. Way back.
I'm just curious about the genesis of the book. How do you decide to focus on Dulles? Is it just reading history, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So why did I decide to focus on Dulles? So I have this mentor, Peter Dale Scott. Do you know the name? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for Peter. So Peter is one of the grand old men of this research, following in the line of C. Wright Mills and others, researching American power and the dark side of American power, the story that we don't get in the nightly news. So Peter is actually a literature professor at Berkeley, or he was for many years, and he's a Dante scholar, among other things, a very learned man, very wonderful, civilized man who was started off life as a Canadian diplomat. His father was, speaking of Leonard Cohen, the poet laureate of Canada, and he was one of young Leonard Cohen's mentors. So Peter started off life as a diplomat, and he was stationed in Poland, and he didn't have particularly strong politics at the time, certainly not left-wing politics, but he came to know a lot of Polish exiles when he came to the US, and he got a job teaching at Berkeley. And he got kind of caught up in their world, and these were very strongly anti-communist people, and they tended to hang around Glenn Campbell, not that Glenn Campbell's, institute, the Hoover Institute at Stanford. So Peter on one occasion was invited to go there. And I tell the story in the book, I'll tell it quickly. He, just like if you were hanging out with Tea Party types, at a dinner party and raging about Obama today, the same kind of virulence, anti-Kennedy virulence, this is probably 1962, I think, late 62, about Kennedy, and what are we going to do about this guy? And a lot of these people were sort of anti-communist exiles. They were Hoover Institute sort of, conservative types, Barry Goldwater types. And finally, this Russian priest, the Russian exile priest, got up, and he was kind of the alpha male in the room, and he held up his hand and said, "Don't worry about the Kennedy problem. The old man will take care of it." And so young Peter Dale Scott at the time thought the old man referred to Joe Kennedy, the patriarch, who would somehow straighten his son out. But I knew when Peter told me this story a few years ago that no, the old man had had a massive stroke and was not in a position to help anybody, and that was of course known to just about everybody in America. The old man, I knew, was the nickname for Allen Dulles. So in that kind of, I'm not saying that conclave was part of the conspiracy, but I'm saying that was sort of what was in the air then. That among those people, those Kennedy haters in the anti-communist sort of network, they would assume that Allen Dulles would step in and take care of business. So when I heard this story, I had just had lunch with Peter in Berkeley and with Karen, and we both looked at each other and said, Allen Dulles. It was one of those things, those moments, this epiphany, because I'd worked with Karen for so long in the Kennedy area because of our book Brothers and so on, and we'd taken it just as far as Bobby Kennedy went. Our first book just looked at Bobby Kennedy's, very dramatic and very secret exploration into who killed his brother, and that was the subject of Brothers. But Bobby was killed himself, of course, in '68 and didn't go all the way, but he was looking in the right direction. He was looking at the CIA's anti-Castro operation as the source of the plot against JFK. And so we were looking in that direction anyway, and Dulles, of course, had put together that operation. So when Peter said it that day, it was like, aha, Allen Dulles, and we went from there.
One more question.
Yeah, sure.
So, this fellow here?
Yeah. Regarding the relationship between the CIA and the Mafia, how would you describe the balance of power there?
The CIA was was above. The CIA often. The gentleman asked in terms of the relationship between the CIA and the Mafia, who was on top. The CIA was on top. The CIA had used the Mafia since World War II, or when it was the OSS, to do its dirty work for them. It's clear that who was running what there from just the kind of evidence that we've dug up. And I think the Mafia played a role in Dallas. Jack Ruby was a mob errand boy, and Bobby Kennedy figured that out immediately. But in terms of the Mafia could never have done the sort of epic things that had to be done in Dallas, and particularly the cover-up. And if it had just been the mob, Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General was known as like the best mob hunter in the country. He would have come down on them with everything he had. And so, I think the first step for a lot of people is to say, oh, it must have been the Mafia, because there's something they're not telling you. And that was where I went originally in my own thinking. It must be organized crime. But then once you start to see the extent to which organized crime is actually on the payroll of the CIA, how they're used by the CIA, how the CIA assassins, kind of run the mob, then it's just a whole lot different story. Yeah.
I have a question.
I'm going to be up signing, and I'd be glad to talk.
Yeah, you can talk
All right.
individual
Yeah.
questions. I'll give you a question somebody can ask him, and that was this is a teaser for the book you didn't mention. The role of Richard Nixon and how his first meeting with Allen Dulles.
One more thing we can blame on Dallas.
Wonderful story. The media may have suppressed your book, But you're on the front page of the Book Passage newsletter. That's 35,000 circulation. You're all here. It's up to us. This isn't the first time the media has suppressed the book, so it's up to you to carry the message. I really, really thank you for being here. Come on up, get your book signed, get lots of copies. This is the book you really need to read.
Wow.